Well, good morning, church family. Joining you again in a little bit different way than usual. We were already set to be out of town for this Sunday, but the plan that we had in place for my absence ended up needing to get pushed for a few weeks, which is fine, but we've decided to do something a little bit different this morning. And for the video, my portion, don't worry, you're not going to have to watch 25 minutes. This is not an episode of The Henry Show. I just want to talk for a few minutes about a couple of things that are important points of conversation for the time of year that we're in, and tie directly to the scripture readings that we will share this morning, the ones you've already heard and any that you will hear after this point. I'm recording this on Ash Wednesday. It's one of those kind of Christian calendar events that has not typically been talked about a lot in Protestant non-mainline, especially churches, and the Churches of Christ being one of those. But I think we've missed out on some of the richness of that history along the way. And there are lots of reasons for that I don't want to dive into. But for today and for the next several weeks, you're going to be hearing a decent amount from me, both here in the auditorium and in writing about the season of Lent. And the passage that I am looking specifically at this morning, which is one of our scripture readings, comes from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. It's a passage where Jesus is tempted by Satan. It's what happens to Jesus immediately after his baptism, and immediately after the voice from heaven confirms his identity and his purpose. The first thing that happens after that is that identity and purpose are challenged. And they're challenged in a way that is tempting. If we don't acknowledge that these temptations are real temptations, then we sort of miss the point of this passage. And I think part of the reason we have missed the point is because we don't understand why these are tempting. But by saying no to the things that Satan offers Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is making sacrifices. And they start small, where he sacrifices the opportunity to eat. But they steadily grow. And in the end, what Jesus sacrifices is the opportunity to bypass the cross, the opportunity to attain some level of power and authority and influence without having to suffer, without having to go through the sacrifice. So what Jesus does here is move towards sacrifice and away from selfishness. That is ultimately the purpose of this season known as Lent. It begins with Ash Wednesday and an encouragement to make a commitment, to give something up. And typically, what we have done culturally, as far as giving something up, is, giving up caffeine for Lent, or giving up chocolate, or something like that. And it's lovely that we want to make better health choices, but that's not really the purpose of Lent. The purpose of Lent is not to get physically healthier, or to experience a week of caffeine loss-related migraines, which I have no desire to do. Instead, I think there are some things that we genuinely do need to give up for Lent. I did this a number of years ago when I was in youth ministry, talking about what should be given up. And what I talked to my teens and parents about was giving up selfishness for Lent, giving up bitterness for Lent, giving up anger for Lent, and actively thinking about what it means to let go of some of those inclinations that hold us back spiritually, that prevent us from being the type of people that God has called us to be. I think those are more akin to the types of sacrifices that we need to emulate from Jesus. What Jesus does in saying no to Satan in these three separate temptations is saying no to self, saying no to selfishness, and instead choosing a path that is holy. Therein lies some real challenge for us, and I think something worth copying and something worth imitating. The reason that I talk about Lent as a season beyond just Ash Wednesday is because this is something traditionally done for 40 days, 40-ish days. You can do some reading on the history there if you would like. But from now until Easter, our passages that we share each and every Sunday, starting with these today, are going to reflect on the nature of Jesus' sacrifice and what that means for us, not in terms of salvation, but in terms of, well, not in terms of going to heaven, but in terms of how we live in response. And you're going to hear me encourage you over and over towards sacrifice, towards selflessness, towards the act of giving, and towards self-reflection, where we think honestly about who we are and why Jesus' sacrifice is necessary, not just in the world in general, but in my life specifically. I've entitled this series of sermons that we're going to go through, Deep Questions, where we are going to ask and wrestle with some of the deeper questions that faithfulness requires of us. In the story of Jesus' temptation, we have to recognize these are three genuine temptations, that there is something enticing to these about Jesus, and something enticing about these to Jesus. And then I think we have to ask the same question of us. What's tempting to us? And behind me, that you can't see in the video, but can see if you're sitting there watching, is an important 1A question, and that's, and why? Why are these things tempting to us? Because I think that helps us navigate life where temptations exist. But that's something we get to wrestle through together. And I think the fact that we have a community is what makes life together in a world where temptations and hardship exist possible. It should be no surprise that the first thing that happens after Jesus' temptation is that he begins to build a community. It's a journey that requires community, both for the sake of encouragement and for accountability. And so as you wrestle with these questions, I guess that question and that question, hopefully that translated right in the video. As you wrestle with these questions, I hope the type of honesty that comes from inside you also moves to accountability, where you're able and willing to invite people to hold you accountable, to ask you hard questions about how you're doing with your various struggles. And at the very least, to be honest with yourself about what those are. And why you find them challenging, tempting. So as you listen to the scripture readings for this morning, as you look at the questions that are on the chalkboard, I hope that you are willing to deal honestly. That type of honesty is, I think, in many ways the first step towards the type of spirituality that Jesus asks of his disciples, that Jesus asks of us as his disciples. Glad you were here with us this morning. I look forward to this series as we talk about what it means to live together, to sacrifice together, and to grow together. Thanks, y'all. Have a good morning. Be blessed.